For today's classic interview, we will go back to my interview with Christopher Snowden from July of 2014. And in the context of a new presidential administration and what the role of government should be, an interesting conversation within that, under that umbrella, is with regard to vices. This is a big conversation within the war on drugs, whether drugs should be illegal, decriminalized, legalized, and taxed just like cigarettes or alcohol. And there's also sort of offshoot conversations to this about sex work, legalizing and regulating sex work. Who does that benefit and who does that hurt? Very interesting conversation, particularly relevant now with the incoming Trump administration, the now here Trump administration. We will go back to my interview with Christopher Snowden from 2014. I'm joined today by Christopher Snowden, who is Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a free market think tank based in London. It's really great to talk to you. You know, we've been talking over the years about taxing vices, and this can be in relation to the war on drugs here in the U.S. with relation to marijuana. In New York City, where we broadcast our program, former Mayor Bloomberg was into taxing sodas, large sodas, for example, banning large sodas. And really, the question I want to start with is, in your experience, what is the goal, or what should be the goal of these taxes, and is it effective? Is it to dissuade usage? Is it to fund alternative programs, etc.?
Well, the view I take, which is taken by many economists, is that if you've got a product which is creating negative externalities, in other words, if it's causing damage or imposing costs upon other people or the government as a collection of people, then it's right and proper that you put a tax on the product so that you claw back the money that's being lost. So the obvious example would be healthcare costs. If you're dealing with alcohol or tobacco or drugs, if drugs were legal, there would probably be excess healthcare costs associated with those products. With alcohol, you've also got issues to do with policing, imprisonment, magistrates' cost. So if you're able to make a decent estimate of what the external costs are of these products, then there's nothing wrong with putting a tax on it. So you get to that point. So if alcohol's costing $10 billion, for example, you put enough tax on your beer and your wine to make back that $10 billion. But the object of that kind of tax, the Pigovian tax, is not in itself to deter the purchase. That would be more of a morality-based tax, a sin tax. That I don't really agree with. I don't think the government should be trying to push people one way or the other when it comes to their own private behavior. But yeah, when it comes to negative externalities, nothing wrong with taxing things.
Is your sense that that it is possible to accurately quantify the dollar value of these negative externalities? In other words, you've made it pretty clear that from a moral standpoint, you don't have a problem with it. From a practical standpoint, are governments or government agencies, health agencies, able to accurately quantify what that amount of money is?
Theoretically, yes, and there are a lot of studies that come out that try to do this. I write actually a lot about this particular issue because these cost studies are almost universally misused. They're often quite flawed to start with, but then they get misrepresented. The most common trick is to try and put a dollar value on emotional costs, for example. So it could be bereavement or an injury or even being upset. I've seen cost studies where they try and quantify how upset people are by seeing vomit or litter in the street as a result of alcohol use. They're not really legitimate costs because they're not financial. And if you're going to put a tax on something, of course, it's financial. Similarly, you'll have costs to do with lost productivity. Lost productivity can be a major cost, but who does it fall on? It doesn't fall on the government. It falls on the individual first and foremost, and may also have some kind of effect on businesses. But whilst those are real costs in terms of income foregone, they are not costs to the government. And we can only justify a tax on a product, which ultimately, of course, is going to go to the government if it's a government cost. So to answer your question, yes, we can. We don't do it very well, but you can make a reasonable estimate of how much drinking or smoking costs a health service. The other thing you need to do, and this is very rarely done, is you also need to look at the benefits. And people find it very distasteful to talk about the benefits of alcohol-related harm or smoking-related harm. But you need to do that if you're going to make a serious economic case. The kind of thing I'm talking about is if you've got a product which kills people 7 or 8 years early as smoking does, yeah, there are clear costs involved in treating smoking-related diseases. But the question you want to know is, what are the costs over the course of a lifetime? You want to compare the healthcare cost of a non-smoker over a lifetime with the costs of a smoker. And anybody who dies after the age of 65 is going to save the government money. The younger they die, this is the simple, hard truth. Once people are not paying taxes anymore, and they go from being someone who's a net contributor to the pot to being someone who's a net taker from the pot in terms of pensions, welfare, prescription charges, nursing home provision, all these kind of things, then the government actually doesn't save money. So the optimum person from a purely economic point of view for the state is somebody who drops dead at the age of 65, preferably from something very quick like a heart attack. So you do need to look at the benefits as well as the costs before you try and work out these figures. But it can be done. We can, to a reasonably satisfactory estimate, it can be done.
I've read a lot of your work, and I've also looked at a lot of other research. And as my audience will know very, very clearly, over the years, I've had trouble taking a firm position on these types of taxes, because on the one hand, I do sympathize and find a lot of logic in the types of arguments that you make. At the same time, and I'll cite some of the numbers from the US CDC, the Center for Disease Control, with a cigarette tax, for example. In 2009, the federal cigarette tax, so putting aside the state tax on cigarettes, rose from 39 cents to $1.01 per pack. And supposedly, if we are to believe the numbers, this reduced the number of smokers by about 3 million smokers over the 3-year period that followed, from 2009 to 2012. Now, if we follow the full chain of costs and benefits and so on and so forth, the idea is that there is a net savings here. But you say that we shouldn't really be influenced by that necessarily, that this type of tax may not really be, do you say it's not a moral tax, or is it not the government's role to impose this kind of tax?
I think it's immoral, and I think it's not the government's role to impose those taxes.
So let's take it piece by piece, though. So why is it the immoral part?
Oh, because I believe that people should be free to live their life as they choose, so long as they don't interfere with other people's rights. And the only way in which people are interfering with people's rights with smoking, aside from the secondhand smoke issue, is if they're placing an excess cost on the welfare state.
And are they not doing that, though? In other words, I know that in the UK, the healthcare system is quite different from that here in the US. There's no question about that. But certainly, having more smokers in the entire risk pool for health insurance is imposing a cost on others who are not smokers, is it not?
If you just looked at it in terms of health, possibly, although even then it's quite doubtful, actually. But I'm coming from a British perspective. I'm looking from the perspective of the entire welfare pot. So I'm including pensions in there,
sure,
which is the single biggest source of expenditure in the welfare state. So what you might lose in terms of healthcare, you actually gain in terms of pensions. And there are actually, with smoking is unusual and counterintuitive, because unlike obesity, where the evidence is more mixed, and unlike alcohol, where there is a clear net negative externality, with smoking, the evidence suggests that even if you didn't have any tax on cigarettes at all, it would still provide a net saving to the government.
And is that because people would be dying earlier and therefore imposing a smaller cost over their lifetime?
It's exactly what it is. And it's not just smoking. Anything that prolongs life, any kind of preventative medicine, tends to be expensive. It's a great myth in public health that if you get people living longer, then you're going to save on healthcare costs. You don't. You just have different sorts of healthcare costs. The short lethal diseases are much cheaper to treat than the long chronic diseases. And the diseases of old age, things like dementia, but also, the hip operations, the cataract operations, the amount of medication people need as they get older, these are all very expensive. The aging population is a real issue for the welfare state. It is expensive having an aging population, which of course is not to say that we shouldn't be trying to have an aging population.
Of course, yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I don't know if you heard during the debate over the Affordable Care Act here in the US, there were many on the left who characterized the idea of those on the right as, do not get sick, But if you do, die very quickly in order to not incur significant cost. And what you're saying is that there is actually some truth to that, that is a way to hold down cost, which is either by keeping people healthy or by ensuring, not ensuring, but hoping that when they get sick, that they die relatively quickly.
Yeah, that's basically how it is. I mean, as I say, from an economic point of view, the optimum citizen in terms of saving money is somebody who works until they're 65, never has a day off, doesn't get any kind of chronic diseases, but then just suddenly drops dead. Now, that's not to say it's optimum for society. We need to separate the moral objectives
Of course.
from the economic objectives. It would be ideal if everybody lived a perfectly healthy life to the age of 100 and then dropped dead from something very quick. But that's not going to happen either. So all I'm saying is, yes, we want people to live longer, or I personally want people to live their own lives first and foremost. But of course, most people would rather live longer than live a shorter amount of time. But we shouldn't fool ourselves that by having people giving up smoking or cutting down on various unhealthy habits, that we're going to save money, because we're not. The opposite's going to happen.
Last thing, and we do have limited time left. When it comes to the legalization and regulation and taxation of sex work, is there an analysis that is similar to the one you make for cigarettes, for example, or is the analysis different?
I think the primary argument for legalizing sex work is much the same as the argument for legalizing drugs, which is that just by having it legal and regulated, you make it less harmful for everybody involved. You could obviously come up with an estimate of the costs that come from both the war on drugs and the criminalization of prostitution. There will be costs on both sides, of course. There will be costs if you have it legal. There will be costs at the moment as you have it illegal. So yeah, you could do an economic study of that, but I think the primary justification for legalizing these kind of activities isn't that it will necessarily save money, although I think it clearly will in the case of drugs, because you'll be able to tax them and you won't have to spend tens of billions of dollars trying to police the existing laws.
Right.
I think the main thing is it actually makes things safer and better for everybody.
All right, we've been speaking with Christopher Snowdon, Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks so much for joining us. Very interesting.
Pleasure.